Hello and welcome to this video on absolute advantage. In this video we're going to look at the concept of absolute advantage and then evaluate this theory. So this is part of our section of topics on trade, and we know there are many benefits to trade such as specialization, economies of scale, more choice and encouraging innovation. And one of the theories that really underpins the way in which we recommend specialization and trading is the theory of absolute advantage. So to illustrate absolute advantage, we're going to look at a very simple example here of how much two economies could produce in one day. We're going to take, imagine a very basic world here with two economies that produce two different goods. So here are our two economies, the UK and China, and here are our two goods, cars and bread, everything that we need. So the way to read this table is, if we imagine in the UK in one day, they could produce 14 cars, or alternatively, they could produce 4 loaves of bread. Whereas in China, they could produce 10 cars in one day, or 8 loaves of bread. And so the question here is, should these countries be self-sufficient, both spend half a day on cars and half a day on bread? Or would it make sense for them to specialize in one, just one, say cars, or just one, say bread, and then trade? Could they be better off? Now, absolute advantage exists. A country has absolute advantage in the production of a goods or service when it is able to produce that good more cheaply in absolute terms than another country. So more cheaply in terms of the amount of labor required, the amount of resources required, the amount of time taken. So if we look at a comparison here between cars and bread, we can see that the UK has the absolute advantage in making cars. It can make 14 in a day versus 10 in China, so it uses less hours to make a car or less labor. Whereas for bread, we can see that in one day, China makes 8 loaves of bread, whereas the UK only makes 4. So China has the absolute advantage in the production of bread. So if we're going to advocate that they should specialize in trade, we're first going to compare that with a scenario in which these countries do not trade, they're self-sufficient. So this would what the countries could consume in one day, assuming they spent half a day producing each good. So a quick reminder here, these are our production possibilities. In the UK, 14 cars or 4 loaves of bread in one day, and in China, 10 cars or 8 loaves of bread in one day. So if the UK was to spend half a day on cars and half a day on bread, it would make 7 cars and 2 loaves of bread. Whereas China would make 5 cars and 4 loaves of bread. So in the world as a whole, we would have 12 cars and 6 loaves of bread. So this is really our self-sufficient scenario, looking at what countries could produce if they didn't specialize, if they would try to do everything, and also if they didn't trade, they were self-sufficient. Now we're going to contrast that with the theory of absolute advantage and what this theory recommends countries should do. So here is our comparison. This is what countries could do if they were self-sufficient. UK 7 and 2, China 5 and 4. A reminder, these are our production possibilities. And the theory of absolute advantage states that countries should specialize in the production of the good in which they have the absolute advantage. If they then trade, they can be better off. Well, as we said earlier, the UK has the absolute advantage in car production and China has the absolute advantage in bread production. So if the UK was just to specialise in cars, we'd have 14 cars being produced in the world. And if China just specialised in bread, we would have 8 loaves of bread in the world. Now, the question is, can we share out, can we trade? Can the UK trade cars for bread and China trade bread for cars so that we can beat this self-sufficient scenario over in the right-hand corner? Well, if we were to allocate our 14 cars, 8 to the UK and 6 to China, and allocate our 8 loaves of bread, 3 to the UK and 5 to China, when we compare this with the self-sufficient scenario, we can actually see that both countries are better off. So to illustrate this and really bring it home, when we had no specialization and no trade, this is what countries could consume. In the UK, 7 cars and 2 loaves of bread, and in China, 5 cars and 4 loaves of bread. When we use the theory of absolute advantage and we ask countries to specialize and then trade, we got this scenario. The UK were consuming 8 cars and 3 loaves of bread. China were consuming 6 cars and 5 loaves of bread. So what we can see is both countries are better off. Both countries are consuming more than if there was no specialization and no trade. We can also illustrate this concept by looking at the PPF, the production possibility frontier. So when we had this earlier, essentially what this shows us is the production possibilities. So in one day, the UK could produce 14 cars, or it could produce 4 loaves of bread, or some combination of the two. So essentially what we're generating here is a production possibility frontier. So this would be the PPF for the UK. Likewise for China, they could produce 10 cars in a day, or 8 loaves of bread, or some combination of the two. And we said the self-sufficient scenario, if both countries spent half a day producing each, they would be in this scenario here. The UK would be producing 7 cars and 2 loaves of bread, and China would be producing 5 cars and 4 loaves of bread. But we said actually, when countries specialize and trade, we can see that both countries can do better, as illustrated in this box at the bottom right. Both countries can do better when they specialize in trade. The UK can consume 8 cars and 3 loaves of bread. That puts the UK at this position here, outside of its PPF. When we look at China, they can consume 6 cars and 5 loaves of bread. They can actually consume a quantity of goods and services beyond their production possibility frontier through using this theory that we should specialize in trade in the good in which we have the absolute advantage. So by specializing in the goods and services in which they have the absolute advantage and then trading, both countries can consume quantities of goods and services outside of their PPFs. This is one of the strongest theories that supports the rationale we see in the modern capitalist economy, where countries focus on a narrow range of tasks in which they are have an advantage of production and then trade. So let's look at some evaluation points. Well, this theory does rely on some assumptions. We have assumed here there's no transportation cost between the UK and China and doesn't reduce any of the benefits of trade, and that cars and bread are of identical quality between the UK and China. In terms of evaluation, there may be strategic reasons to maintain production of both goods. We want to not necessarily be reliant on the Chinese economy for our food production, for our bread, so we might choose to still maintain some bread production even if it doesn't make economic sense. Sometimes it can be hard. We have a very simple example, but it can be hard here to determine who has absolute advantage. Other factors such as exchange rates may play a part. And finally, it depends on the rate of exchange. We've seen that, yes, we can specialize in trade, but it depends on the rate at which that trade takes place as to whether or not the country can be better off. So in this video, we've looked at the concept of absolute advantage, and we finished off there at the end by evaluating it. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.